This episode of the Your Listener podcast will contain references to adult themes. Please do not listen if you are under the age of discretion in your jurisdiction. Hello there, John Culturillo here, the counsellor of Your Listener. Thank you for joining us for this episode. As usual, thank you to everybody who makes this work possible. And also, as usual, if you have concerns about yourself or somebody else, please never take what you find on the internet or in the media as advice. Seek advice from a professional. If you are in Australia and are seeking counselling, you can find my contact details in the description of this episode. And in this episode, it is my pleasure to welcome my guest, Suzanne Noble from the United Kingdom. Susan, thank you so much for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me, John. I'm very excited.
It's my pleasure. Susan, tell us about yourself and what you do.
So I host a weekly podcast called Sex Advice for Seniors, and I describe myself as a sex educator. I'm not a trained sex therapist. I'm not a sexologist. I started going on a sexual journey myself when I was in my 40s, and as a result of that, I wrote a couple of books, one which did very well, and like many other women, went through the menopause in my 50s. My libido took a bit of a nosedive, and I had to figure out what was going on there, and then came back into, feeling more sexual and learning quite a lot about how to be a sexual older woman now that I'm 65. So I talk about my own experiences, and I interview experts every week on my show that have come from the world of sex in some way, whether that's around dating or around alternative lifestyles like tantra or swinging, or just people who, like yourselves, work with couples who are trying to figure out how to just be better with each other.
Wonderful, and links to Susan's work will be in the description of this episode. Now, in today's episode, we're going to be discussing some of the beliefs and many of the myths that exist surrounding sexuality and intimacy in seniors as we age. Now, Susan, to start us, let's perhaps address the elephant in the room. Many people, I intuit, have a belief that once we reach a certain seniority in our life, we effectively stop wanting to be intimate, or our desire to be intimate drastically decreases. But what's been the reality of that situation in your experience?
I think it's probably one of the most taboo topics that still exists, is talking about sex in later life. I mean, I've certainly found that there seems to be a reaction to it like, oh my gosh, do people still have sex at your age? And so there is this assumption, because society doesn't really talk about it, that intimacy stops when we reach a certain number of birthdays, and it just falls off a cliff and it ends. And I think, based on what I hear from my listeners and from my followers, that for a certain proportion of the population that is actually true. I mean, I think that there's a lot of women, especially women, not necessarily, but seems to be the reaction I get mostly from men, is that my wife doesn't want to have sex anymore, she's not interested, she's going through the menopause, or she's just not feeling very sexual. And aligned with that is many women are saying, well, you know what, I just don't have the same desire for sex that I had before. And I feel like I don't get aroused in the same way as I used to. And I don't have to procreate anymore. And so, you know what, I'm done with it. I'm finished with it. But there are, again, a significant number of people who do want to continue having sex, or are continuing to have sex, and are having really great, pleasurable sex, and exploring the wonderful buffet that is sex. And so, that we can't just cast, everybody with the same brush. There are some people who don't want to have sex anymore, and there are a significant number of people who definitely still do want to have sex. And I think, often the problem that I encounter is that, and I know, from my own personal experience, is that sex in later life does change. It is different. The way we become aroused especially as older women, is different. It's more responsive. It's not so spontaneous. It might be more context driven. We might need a lot more foreplay, for example. We might have issues around painful intercourse that we can alleviate by using, pharmaceuticals like vaginal estrogen, lubricants, stuff like that. For men, they may be struggling with some erectile dysfunction, and they may be considering how to overcome that. What are they going to do? Are they just going to go out and get the blue pill, or are they going to just try and find a more natural solution? What's going on with their body? So I do see that things do change as we get older, and it's a mistake to think that we're always going to be having sex in the way that we did in our 20s. When we're in our 50s, 60s, and beyond, things have to change, and as a result of that, we have to change with it. And then, as you've probably discovered in your job, one of the challenges around that is actually getting people to talk about it. Because for a lot of couples, sex was just something they did. It wasn't really something that they talked about. That was certainly the case in my own marriage. We didn't really discuss sex. It didn't really, we just did it until after a while it became predictable and monotonous and rather uninteresting. And bringing up the subject was difficult because it wasn't something that we were comfortable discussing. So, all of these issues contribute to beliefs around, does desire expire at a certain age, or is my body just not up to it anymore?
So there are a number of interesting nuances in that analysis. First of all, biology is a reality and our physiology does change, and there's an evolutionary explanation as to why that may happen. Past a certain point, it is less of an ideal situation for reproduction, and hence it is natural that our body moves into a state in which it is no longer as desirous of sexual intercourse as it would be when we're younger. And desire is very much controlled by neurophysiological activity. Our brain controls that. So the flow of chemicals and the transmission of electrical signals, that is going to change as we age. So that is definitely a reality, and it's perfectly valid to not have sex on the basis that perhaps we don't desire. It's something that I say often is sex has to feel right. It has to feel safe. And if it doesn't feel right, or if it doesn't feel safe, then proceeding with it may actually cause us, at the very least, some psychological distress. It could even extend beyond that. So it's important for sex to feel safe. So biological realities aside, I would argue, and I'd like to hear your perspectives on this, that given that we hold a belief that it is a taboo subject and that it should not be discussed, or perhaps that it simply shouldn't be discussed in the same way as one would when they're younger, I would suggest that that has a significant impact on how people might view themselves as they age and how willing they are to engage in intimacy. Because something quite fascinating, which my audience will know I speak on quite regularly because of it is such an integral part of the human experience, is that our thoughts and our feelings and our actions and the world outside of us all have omnidirectional effects on one another. And so every element of our environment affects each other element. And so if we are fed the belief that there is anything negative about sexuality or intimacy in our seniority, we are more likely to internalize that, and it is more likely to influence how we see ourselves. For example, if we believe that people think it's taboo, then it may lead us to justify or try to rationalize it by saying, maybe it's taboo because I must not be as desirable at this age to my partner, which then leads us to seek evidence for that and ignore evidence to the contrary, and that then leads us to not act to change that perception. And so if we believe that we are less desirable, or we believe that sex is a taboo subject, we are less likely to do anything to satisfy the need for it, which then reinforces that we don't feel like having it and reinforces the belief, and it prevents further action. So one of the major barriers to overcome when helping an older couple perhaps is to investigate whether they truly do not desire sex, or whether they have learned that sex is somehow negative and that they should avoid it. Because with exploration, it can be that we can discern between the two. If someone is genuinely content not having sexual intercourse, they can come to that conclusion. But if they want sexual intercourse but feel it is bad somehow and that they are suppressing their practice of it, then that has a very different feeling associated with it, subjective feeling.
Yeah, it's a great point, and I totally echo what you're saying because I think that so much of what we believe is just these internalized assumptions, ageist assumptions, frankly, and it's not even just around sex, it's around many other aspects of life as you get older, believing that maybe we shouldn't be so adventurous, we shouldn't be so loud, we should be wear pastel colors, There's so many assumptions about how we age that that people do internalize and then reflect back on others as being true. And I think that when it comes to sex, we have very few role models that we can look to as sexual older adults and say, wow, those people are great. I mean, a lot of the assumptions are just based on either not having any role models at all or just negative stereotypes, which people then internalize as their own belief system. So I think that's a really valid point. The other thing I think that I've heard from experts, and I know to be true myself, is that when it comes to getting turned on, it doesn't really matter what age you're at, but I suspect especially at an older age, then there are a number of key factors that need to be in place. And they're not just hormones. They're not just about what's going on in your brains, the neurological stuff. It's actually about how much stress you're having in your life, right? Like, my generation, for instance, has often at this stage got very complex lives. We might be looking after elderly parents who need a lot of support. We might be looking after grandchildren. We might still be working, and there's a lot of pressure on our time. And as a result of that, sex then goes somewhere off the menu, right? It's like, you know what? When I can get all this stuff off the table, then maybe I'll think about sex. But at the moment, I'm too stressed out. And I hear this from friends of mine, like, I'm too stressed. When you're not getting any sleep, when you're too stressed, when you're not feeling like maybe you're getting the support that you would like around the house, maybe around some domestic chores and things like that, if your partner's not paying attention to you and you're not feeling particularly desired, as you said, perhaps we've got a little bit around our middle that's just turned up that we're not very happy about, lack of body confidence, all of these things can contribute to just feeling like sex really isn't a priority. So I think when we look at libido and we look at how we get turned on, I think we also have to consider that there's lots of external factors besides just societal expectations that we shouldn't be having it anymore, lots of other external factors that make it less of a priority for ourselves.
Those are more incredibly excellent points in that analysis. I want to briefly make salient your suggestion about how we don't necessarily have role models and a objective standard to which we can compare what by which we can judge what is normal for a person of a certain age. All too often I see people making postulations about what's normal, and the problem is that in any of these cases, it is extremely difficult to know in many of these cases, when we discuss social phenomena like sex, it's very difficult to judge what's normal because measuring that is almost always a biased process. Even by statistical standards, if you can sample enough people to obtain an impression of what the majority or the most common sexual practices and norms are at people of a given age, it's all too possible that those did not become normal due to inevitability. They became normal because we created the situation. And I'm not again suggesting that society is the main factor. That aside, it's perfectly possible that certain opinions about sex that are propagated or certain perceptions of sex that are propagated in the media and so forth create an impression of what is normal, which we then internalize, but we wouldn't have internalized that had we not been exposed to it. So knowing what is actually truly natural is incredibly difficult to judge it because we can't remove the societal influence. But Speaking to logistical barriers, you're absolutely right. People do take more responsibility, or they have stresses in life that very much do stand in the way. And it's actually one of the most common issues that is both a symptom in itself and a cause of other symptoms in marital problems in the couples whom I counsel. All too often, whether as a result of conflict or conflict resulting as a result of it, couples aren't spending very much time with each other. Their time together, their quality time together, is significantly less than when they were younger. And I would say there is a reciprocal influence between that and the conflict. If people feel they are conflicted with their partner often, they're less likely to feel motivated to spend time with them, which makes them feel worse about the relationship, which perpetuates the conflict, because the conflict is a reflection of how they're feeling. But if they are not spending very much time with each other to begin, because they may reason that there are other matters that must take priority, or some people may internalize the belief that spending time together is something you do when you're young, and when you're older, you just tend to other life matters and don't bother with it. That can very quickly breed resentment, not necessarily at your partner. It can breed resentment at the situation, which then presents itself as conflict between the two. So it's really important for people to become aware that there's a very fine balance to be struck in how we interact with each other, and sometimes addressing that balance can change the reality to something, and it didn't have to be an inevitability, that we can actually change the situation to be more consistent with what our true needs are.
Yeah, and I would just add to that I spoke to somebody recently who said that one of the ways she gauged how well couples were doing with each other was exactly looking at how much time they spent with each other. And she actually gave it a mathematical equation, which was that she said that couples need to spend 3% of their week with just on their relationship. So that's just talking to each other, engaging in each other, doing an activity or whatever, 3% of their week, right? And it sounds a minuscule amount of time until you work out that 3% of your week is something like, I don't know, it's something like an hour and a half of time, right? An hour and a, I think it works out to something like an hour and a half a day, something like that, right? An hour and a half a day actually of dedicated time with your partner, like talking about real things that are going on in your relationship. I suspect most couples would say that actually sounds like a lot, right? Because most couples are not spending 60, 75 minutes just on talking about, like, how's your day? What happened? Any challenges that came up, right? And the other thing that she did was, which I also thought was clever, was just looking at a couple's bank statements and working out how much of the time of the bank statement was things like food shopping, just doing activities and things that had nothing to do with the relationship, and how much of it was actually nice things that couples could do together. So I think there's also that whole idea about, if, as you said, if you don't actually spend time with your partner on your relationship, then your relationship is going to die, because part of what it needs to flourish is time and being watered. And I think the plant analogy is good, because if you don't water a plant, it dies, right? And I think that the other thing about the aspect of spending time and around conflict is that I suspect part of the reason why people come and see people like you is because they don't actually know what good communication looks like in a relationship. And they don't actually know how to talk to each other sometimes without blame, without shame, without making the other person feel bad. And I think that we don't learn good communication skills before we go into a relationship. We go in with the communication skills that we have, and we hope that they're going to be good enough. And certainly what I've seen is that the reasons why most couples don't make it is just because their communication skills are so poor. they don't actually know how to talk to each other, not just about sex, but around everything, whether it's around finance, whether it's around work, whether it's around family. It all ends up getting chucked into the same bucket of blame and shame and feeling bad, and somehow you end up walking away feeling, that either you've done something wrong, you're a terrible person, or you're just not good enough.
Indeed. 3% of one's week is approximately 5 hours in total, so that means less than 1 hour per day, but it is still substantial. And you're absolutely right. Something that I encourage all my couples to do is to spend more time with each other. And interesting that you mention using the bank statement as a gauge, because often when logistical issues are barriers, I will encourage people to actually use mundane tasks as opportunities for bonding. So, for example, even conducting the grocery shopping together or completing the housework together actually becomes a more interesting exercise when the two of you are present. It's not a direct analog, but I'd say the grocery shopping is certainly more interesting when I'm doing it with somebody else, which I don't do very often. I normally do it alone. But if somebody's there, then it becomes a more interesting exercise. And having that collection of positive experiences gives you a positive mental representation of what the relationship is, which then makes it more likely to overcome any conflicts. But you're absolutely right that relationships are literally founded on foregoing time alone for time with somebody else, because you can achieve more combined than you can individually. You can achieve goals that you can't achieve individually when you're combined, meeting relational needs, which we all effectively have.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was actually my father's wise words who said, and my mother actually, who said, relationships are about sharing life's experiences. That's how they defined what a marriage looks like. It's a person with whom you share life's experiences. And how often do we see couples who have completely remove themselves from sharing life experiences, where they're doing everything individually, and essentially they're just housemates that are living under the same roof, right? And everything that they do goes on separately. And I would say, that's not a real relationship. That's just two people who may or may not be friends. He also said that one needs to prioritize their partners when they're bringing up a family, because if you prioritize your kids, then your kids are going to leave home, and then you're not going to know who your partner is anymore. And I know that modern couples with kids find that a tremendously challenging concept, because so many have been taught that children are the focus, they're the priority. And so often we see couples that just really don't have anything to say to each other anymore, because all their energy, all their time, all their devotion has gone into bringing up their kids, who do eventually hopefully leave home, and then you're left with this stranger. So how can we make time and prioritize our partner in relationships, in situations where we do have a lot on our plate? We are all modern people these days are juggling lots of things to do, and it can be really hard. And I know, I wasn't tremendously successful myself, so I'm not a great role model, but I do know that when I see couples that are really together, that have been together over decades, what I notice about them is, one, they're still sexual. And I think that's, from where I'm standing, I think that's really important. They've made intimacy a real priority, and they've evolved in their intimate lives as their bodies have changed, as their libidos have changed, as things have changed. And the second thing is they genuinely like each other, and they genuinely like being with each other, and they want to spend time together and with each other.
There's an interesting domain to be extracted from that discussion, and it's the reasons that we form relationships initially. We may assume, well, it is the case that we are creatures of desire. Desire drives behavior inevitably. So it may be easy to assume based on that we accept and form relationships with the partners whom we find desirable, and whether those desires are congruent with our reasonable needs and are going to make for a healthy relationship varies between people, between situations, but we may assume that it's always based on that desire. But desire can be somewhat complicated in the sense that I've known of people to form relationships with partners whom they actually didn't find desirable, with whom they weren't actually attracted. And although it's difficult to discern objectively, what seemed to be the case was that they had formed relationships based on what was modeled to them. And what was modeled to them was not desire, was not joyful interaction between partners. It was relationships as a logistical exercise, not as this wholesome bonding pursuit between people, the wonder and enjoying the wonders that are relationships. And if we observe relationships in a logistical sense, in our families, for example, let's imagine individuals, let's consider individuals who are raised in households in which their parents are constantly arguing and there is little to no affection exchanged. A child learns by observation. They have to learn a model, a framework through which to view the world. If they observe that, they're most likely going to internalize that relationships are just logistical exercises. We just make things happen, so to speak. But there is none of that qualitative joyfulness that makes relationships special. And people can then internalize that as being a mature adult. If I'm a mature adult, I don't choose the partner to whom I am attracted. I don't choose the partner who makes me feel that joy. I choose a partner with whom I think I will be logistically successful, whom seems to be a good person and have all the right values. That's me choosing a partner for the right reasons. That's what an adult does. And yes, choosing a partner with the right values is certainly important, and you certainly don't want to choose someone just because they're physically attractive to you, but somebody who doesn't have any virtues and who is, going to ultimately harm you or exploit you, that's not a healthy outcome. But it's important to realize that desire is just a naturally occurring part of our psychology, and if we ignore it, it's not something on which we can act all the time. It has to be tempered. But if we ignore it entirely, then it is going to have real effects on how we function, and could then potentially lead into have effects on the situations in which desire shouldn't have any say, and it has to be very more logic based decision making. So it's important to have that balance, and I intuit that if we have logistical models of relationships rather than more wholesome models of relationships to which we're exposed when we're children, then we're more likely to mimic those relationship behaviors when we're older and perhaps even into our senior years.
Yeah, and I suspect as well that if we grow up in a household where the primary mode of communication is shouting at each other, for example, then we don't learn the nuances of how to communicate in a healthy way. We don't learn that actually shouting doesn't really or rarely resolves conflict, that actually two people speaking with confidence and being clear in their communication about what's going on is probably going to be a lot better in the long run than just expecting that eventually one person will outscream the other person. And so if we don't grow up again with those healthy communication styles, which again, I'm in a generation where by and large fathers were absent, mainly, right? Mainly in my generation, my father went off to work. I never really knew what he did, if I'm honest. I knew he worked in a corporate job, and he went off and he came back late in the evening. And I didn't really spend much time with him as a kid, because he was gone. And my mother was a teacher, so she got holidays off, the same school holidays that I did. And she taught me, a lot, frankly. And my parents were both are both incredibly well educated. So that contributed to the way that I see the world. And I think, I'm quite lucky with that. But that doesn't mean that I'm immune from making bad choices. And I think that we all have to, as you said, there's a balance to be struck between desiring and wanting someone and feeling attracted to them and looking at them and you light up, and having them share your values, your virtues, enjoy doing similar types of activities, have a shared view of life, where you want your future to be. And I think at this stage of life, for a lot of people, it's going back to the beginning of our conversation. A lot of people feel that, especially when they're looking for a new partner, because divorce at our age group is, I think it's at an all-time high. There's more people getting divorced post-50 than there ever were. So there's more single people out there, more people looking for partners, more people trying to figure all of this stuff out. And for many people, they're really struggling because it feels like this new landscape, this whole dating space, thinking about what we want, what we desire, things that we really didn't think too much about when we were younger. We just kind of went into relationships, I suspect, like I did, hoping for the best.
As a counsellor, I receive referrals from others, and I also like to help my audience become aware of resources and other providers which may be beneficial, as well as help other individuals and organisations gain exposure. That's why I host the Your Listener Partner Network, and I'd like to thank my partners for their support. I'd like to introduce Art of Caring. Art of Caring offers compassionate counselling that is person-centred, neuro-affirming, LGBTQIA+ inclusive, trauma-aware and client-led for children, teens and adults on the Gold Coast in Australia. Run by Deborah Both, an ACA registered counsellor with lived experience as a late diagnosed ADHD adult and parent of neurodivergent young adults, Art of Caring provides a genuinely understanding space for neurodivergent individuals, parents and families navigating life's complexities. Services include individual counselling, Lego-based therapy groups, and creative group programs including art and craft sessions at Healing Hooves Incorporated in Nerang. Deborah is available in person at Healing Hooves Incorporated and online. Private clients as well as NDIS self-managed and plan-managed participants are welcome. Contact Deborah at www.artofcaring.com.au. Indeed. Susan, I'd like to segue into some other misconceptions or perhaps beliefs that need challenging in the realms of intimacy in senior years. What are some of the misconceptions that you witness in your work regularly that need to be challenged with regards to how people practice intimacy or desire intimacy in their older years?
Yeah, it's a great question. And the main change that happens when you're older is around how we become aroused. It's a fundamental change that completely changes how we need to approach sex in later life. And it's often the thing that's most misunderstood, because when we stop feeling the same strength in our libido, when we stop feeling that excitement when we're with somebody or we see somebody across the room that we think is really attractive and our body doesn't respond in the way that we are used to it responding, immediately we think, well, that must mean I'm just not sexual anymore, because arousal does fundamentally change from that spark that we may feel when we in our younger years, when we're with somebody and we're already starting to think about perhaps being intimate with them and getting very excited about that, to needing more in our later years. And for me, I need, for example, to schedule my sex life in my diary. I want to know when I'm having sex, because thinking about when I'm having sex and that I'm going to have sex and that it's going to happen at this particular time, and perhaps there's been some sexy texts that have been exchanged between me and my partner that are starting to get the wheels operating, so that by the time I'm actually in the space where we're going to have sex, I'm ready and my body knows it's going to happen and it gets excited and turned on. And physical touch becomes much more important. Foreplay becomes much more important, and all those little cues that we can share with our partner that just let them know that we still desire them, we still want them, we still think they're sexy and hot, making them feel beautiful and wanted. And I think these things are not just things that are aimed at women, they're for men as well. I hear men that tell me, you know what, I just want to feel that a woman wants me again. I want to feel that I'm being desired in the same way, that I'm really turning them on. So there's a lot more for me, like preparation that goes into getting ready for sex, whether it's putting on something that makes me feel sexy and desirable, whether it's lighting candles, soft music, like all sorts of things. And I think that we've got to, when people say, oh, it doesn't sound very spontaneous. Well, no, it's not. It's not very spontaneous, to be honest. But what it is it's getting me into the mental mindset of that I'm going to have sex, and that's what we need. And it's not just me saying that. It's probably every single sex therapist and sexologist that I've spoken to has said, we just need a bit more time, and we need to have those wheels turning in our heads. So I think the misconception that we're just going to get turned on like this, it's the most inaccurate. And going back to the beginning of the conversation, it's the most potentially harmful in terms of then removing this idea that we no longer can be sexual. The other thing, of course, is that when we do have sex, there are sometimes barriers to pleasure and pain, and pain is real. I mean, when women's hormones deplete, vaginal walls thin out, and it can hurt. And sometimes going to the doctor doesn't provide you with the answer that you're looking for. I was told, well, it's just a consequence of your age. Just use more lube and you'll be fine. But I wasn't fine, and using more lube didn't actually help. And eventually it was actually a friend of mine who told me about a topical estrogen that's, just solely for the vaginal area. And that was just like transformative for me. So there's that. And similarly with men, men start to see that midlife spread, and they don't realize how much of their erectile function is caused sometimes by just an unhealthy lifestyle. And that with more exercise, with eating properly, with actually looking after their health, they can regain their erectile function without having to resort to pills. And so I think that I've heard lots of men say, I'm definitely feeling a bit grumpier, I'm not as sexual. Again, a lot of that is down to just loss of testosterone, which, you can go and get testosterone replacement therapy, and that can just top you up, giving you that vitality and that energy that perhaps you're not feeling anymore. So I think that there's a lot of these tropes around getting older, grumpy old man, like saggy woman, all of this. It's not very helpful. And sometimes it also prevents us from experiencing pleasure, because we don't know that actually there are solutions out there. There are things that we can do to transform our sex life, and they're easy.
Addressing the matter of how arousal is different in different age groups, and that as we age, we may have to place more emphasis on time and gradual conducting of the sexual process, physical touch, foreplay, those emotional or relational aspects of of intimacy that precede the act of intercourse. It's interesting that we should mention this as being so important in senior years, because given the chance, I would actually advise couples of all ages to place more emphasis on those aspects, because even though I'm not judging people for needing sex, sex is a natural need. Sexual intercourse as an act in the realm of our relationships is a relatively brief time period. It may last a matter of minutes for some people. And then the after effects are different depending on your own hormonal balance and so forth, and your sex your individual sex plays a part in that as well. But you can maintain those relational elements like foreplay and physical touch and the sharing of emotion for a far longer period of time and sustain the pleasure in it. And even for some couples who perhaps may not be able to have sexual intercourse due to physical barriers or due to other psychological issues. Some people might identify as asexual. Some people might have difficulties engaging in the act due to trauma, sexual trauma. There are so many wonderful ways to practice intimacy, and I suspect that many of them are foregone amongst people in general, but I would encourage even younger people to focus more on them, because there's so much to be gained from sharing of emotion and sharing of non-sexual sentiments. And as I said, it sustains. It can be sustained for far longer than the pleasure from sexual intercourse, and if anything, perhaps it is a bit more connective and a bit more relational, because it involves more of the mental relational resources rather than simply physical effort.
Yeah, and I would just say as well that sexual intercourse is a rather limited way of looking at sex. It's and that for many couples, sexual intercourse is perhaps not even on the menu, because if a man's had a prostate operation, for example, it's likely that he won't regain his erectile function for a significant period of time. So, I think we have to look at sex, and even the word foreplay bothers me, because foreplay can be just sex in itself. It can be the whole act. And some people enjoy foreplay much more than they enjoy penetrative sex. So I think penetrative sex is like a very small part of what constitutes sex in general. And I certainly, when I was younger, thought that penetrative sex was just mainly what sex was, if not solely what sex was, because my married partner, didn't really like any of the other stuff. So that's basically what it came down to. And as we get older, we realize that actually, one of the privileges that we've got, if we've not got children living with us anymore, and we're finally living with just our partner, is that we've got the privilege of time. We've got all of this time to be able to just literally laze around in bed, laugh, play, have fun, foreplay, main play, whatever you want to call it. And it doesn't have to be restricted to a series of activities that ultimately leads up to penetration. So I think we need to remove this idea that sex has a variety of components that just lead up ultimately to penetrative sex, because for a lot of people, penetrative sex is not the ultimate aim. So I think the more expansive we can look at sex, the better in general. And also the more opportunity we have to explore all the erogenous zones in our body, to explore all the wonders that is sex, that that we as humans are capable of, which is just magical. And I think that's the thing for me about putting it in the diary and thinking of it not just as something that happens over a few minutes, but actually as something that happens over a few hours, that you can just relax and enjoy yourself. So I think that that's one of the, the key opportunities that we have as older people to reinvent our sex lives. And of course, we know that people at this age, if they are curious, may be exploring other types of lifestyles. They might be looking at going beyond monogamy. They might be looking at kink. They might be looking at, meeting up with other couples. I think it's, one of the things that I've definitely noticed as I've kind of engaged with various communities is the number of older people within these communities. I'm always shocked actually by how many communities are now full of older people who have, who at this stage of life decided that actually their rather predictable sex life needed a bit of a revamp, and they've gone out to check out what else is out there. So I think that there's so many different misconceptions when it comes to A, what we think actual sexual activity looks like, and B, that we're too old or past it, both of which are complete nonsense.
Absolutely. The definition of intimacy as constituting just penetrative sex or the facilitation thereof is quite limiting, and it is very helpful. It's incredibly fulfilling for people if they think more broadly about all the other ways that we can show gestures of affection toward one another. Can be wonderful. I'm wondering if you've encountered any beliefs that people may hold, or any situations that you've seen enacted that might be quite difficult to believe in a very bizarre way for people until they actually were exposed to them. An example that I have is that I was recently reading some articles, and I learned that some people hold the belief that if a couple has sexual intercourse while standing, that it reduces the likelihood of pregnancy, which to me was rather surprising because I've always known the mechanics of reproduction. So for me, it's unfathomable somebody should believe that. But have you encountered any particularly bizarre or or difficult to believe ideas in the course of your work that might be humorous but also very very educational to debunk them?
Oh God, that's a funny example. I suppose the things like that. A woman looks at a man's penis that might be a bit large and say, "Oh, you know what? I couldn't possibly take that." And we know that women's anatomy, that our vaginas tend to accommodate different size penises. So generally speaking, we can take larger sizes. We just need a lot more preparation, perhaps, and extended foreplay. But generally, you can do that. And just a funny, it's more of a lifestyle thing. Is in a few weeks' time, I go to a naturist village in France called the Cap d'Agde, which is 40,000 naked people that live in a village in France. It's walled. It's the biggest naked village in the world. It's incredibly good fun. And but one of the things that surprised me the first time I went there was the number of significantly older people that went there. I mean, significantly. And I would say that, the average age was probably 40s to 50s, but there were people who were well into their 70s and 80s there, well into that age group. And everybody just, hanging out naked, enjoying themselves. And I think that for me, one of the benefits of going to that place, especially when I went the first time, was just body confidence, because you recognize when people have no clothes on that actually even the people that you think are drop dead gorgeous when they've got clothes on, when they've taken them off, there's still a bit of cellulite. There might be some stretch marks. Like, nobody is absolutely perfect, right? Everybody's got something around their body that they may not particularly like, but it just made me realize, like, we're all human. We're all walking around to this earth with the bodies that we've been given, and it made me feel so much more comfortable and relaxed about just being naked in front of someone, which I know can be a huge challenge for women, especially during the menopause and seeing our bodies change. It can be really distressing. And I know as I get older, I keep going like, how did that skin get like that? I didn't notice that before. But, this is just a consequence of aging. It's just the way it is.
So in effect, there's a sense of liberation in being nude, knowing that the people around you are not judging you because they have the same sense of liberation that you do, and you're all chasing the same goal, which is liberation and being able to feel comfortable in your body.
Yeah, absolutely.
Susan, today we've had an absolutely fantastic discussion, and no doubt many members of our audience will have been exposed to some ideas with which they may not be too familiar. So thank you so much for joining us today. I've really enjoyed this discussion. Is there anything with which you'd like to leave our audience, or any parting thoughts for us?
Yeah, well, I have a saying on sex advice for seniors that desire never retires. So I would like your audience to just take that and absorb that little saying and know that, sex doesn't need to end just because of changes going on with your body, or maybe you're feeling like you're just not getting turned on as much as you used to. There are solutions out there for you. There's, like I said, some pharmaceutical solutions, but there's also just realizing that, there are plenty of people out there still enjoying sex, still having a great time, and you could be one of them.
Desire never retires, Susan. I love that adage. Thank you so much for leaving that with us. And to our audience, thank you so much to everybody for joining us today. If you have concerns about yourself or somebody else, please seek advice from a professional or somebody else that you trust. If you are in Australia and are seeking counselling from me, you can find my details in the description of this episode. You can also find Susan's work in the description of this episode, links to her work. If you have feedback on the program or would like to contact me for any other reason, please feel free to contact me. I always love to hear from the audience. And until next time, everybody, take care.